By the time you see this, Norman Grimm will be dead. Grimm was a brutal rapist and killer who died by lethal injection after 25 years on death row. He's Florida's 15th execution this year. That's a record. And he's the 41st execution nationwide. I'm Anne Emerson, and today my guest says he was once a strong believer in the death penalty, but now he's fighting the 42nd execution. But before he tells us what changed his mind, let me tell you a little bit about the inmate who was just executed, Norman Grimm. Grimm was convicted back in 1998. He attacked his neighbor, Cynthia Campbell. She was an attorney who lived right next door to him in East Milton, Florida. One night, her window was smashed in, and while she talked to police, Grimm invited her over to his house. That's when he attacked and killed her. To be clear, Grimm's never tried to fight his sentence or tried to blame any trauma on his violence, and it's very unusual for someone not to fight their execution. We reached out multiple times to both Florida's Attorney General's office and Governor Ron DeSantis' team to ask, why now? Why the rush? DeSantis still has not gotten back to us, and the AG's office would only say they're just following state law. Here's the thing. Florida hasn't seen numbers like this in decades. 15 executions in a single year. But here's my question to you. Isn't Norman Grimm just the kind of cold-blooded killer the death penalty was made for? What am I missing? Let's find out, and I want you to weigh in. Drop a comment and tell me what you think about the grim reality of the death penalty. And be sure to subscribe to Criminally Obsessed so you never miss a tough conversation like this one. Joining me now is Abe Bonowitz, the co-founder of Death Penalty Action. The state has said that Grimm wanted to die, that he had waived all of his appeals. And if he's asking to move forward with this execution, why do you think it's important to save him?
For us, it's less about saving him than standing up and saying that we can't trust government with the power to kill people. Government we don't trust them to fill potholes. We don't trust them to come up with a proper vaccine. How are we trusting them with the power to kill and always get it right and always make it fair? You know, of course, Norman Grimm is waiving his appeals and doesn't want to move forward because death row itself is torture, and this is a ticket out. You know, this is a way for him to be done with it. And, you know, and I have to respect that in a way. I personally don't know how I would live in the conditions of death row for dozens and dozens of years. Nobody should have to live that way. And that they put up with it and that they have to survive in that is significant too. And especially if you're sick, you know, and that's why, especially for people who support the death penalty, because they want it to be the worst thing, you know, really that's why they should throw away the key. If you want it to be worse, if you want the punishment to be worse and for the prisoner, the convicted person to suffer the most, throw away the key and make them die in prison, because that's worse.
Florida is carrying out more executions more regularly than other states have or would. And do you think that they are carrying out the law, or they're just, is this something that Floridians want, or is this something that this is the law and this is what we have to do?
This idea that we're carrying out the law and we're doing this for victim families is a charade. It's a falsehood. Yes, they have people on death row, and yes, they're following through on their death sentences. But the truth is that we can be safe from people who've done awful crimes and hold them accountable without executions. And we know that because that's what we do in the vast majority of cases. What we also know is that when you poll people and you ask them, do you like the death penalty, yes or no, you get more people saying that they like it. But when you offer, would you prefer throwing away the key, death by incarceration, which more people call life in prison without the possibility of parole, but would you prefer throwing away the key to execution? More people prefer that, and especially when they understand how the system fails us as a public policy. We don't need the death penalty to be saved from people who've done awful crimes or to hold them accountable, and we know that because that's what we do in the vast majority of cases.
with 15 executions in 1 year, Florida's got another one right
We've
after
got
this one. We're
16
gonna
and
be
17 already scheduled. Yes.
so we're looking at the most executions in modern history, justice or vengeance.
It's vengeance because justice is throwing away the key. Justice is knowing that this person's never going to get out. Justice is knowing that they are suffering in prison. And if you don't think it's suffering in prison, then you've not been to prison. And certainly you've not been sick or old in prison. It's horrific. Nobody wants to do that.
Who is Norman Grimm? What do you know about this case?
Well, I have to say that, in part because uh, it's happened so fast. I'm not an expert on this particular case. What I will say is that he was without state court counsel until 4 days after his death warrant was signed. This is very unusual. His prior defense attorney had retired years ago and never formally withdrew, leaving him unrepresented as the state pursued an execution date. And despite knowing this, Florida pushed forward and violated the most basic principle of justice, that every person deserves meaningful legal representation. And now his newly appointed counsel has only had a few days to look at these issues. And it's just not enough time to address these things.
And you've called these executions a moral failure by the state. And
Morally, economically, socially, etc.
and I mean, and would you agree that like what Grimm did to begin with was a moral failure? Of course,
Of course,
when
look,
he killed.
nobody is making excuses for the murders that are committed by people. Should we be safe from them? Absolutely. Can we hold them accountable? Yes. No other state is executing people like this, even states with a high number of people on death row who have exhausted their appeals. So what's going on now is a question mark. Really, you need to ask Ron DeSantis. For us, it's simply we're like drinking from a fire hose. It's one after the next, and there's hardly any time to get ready or to understand what are the issues in a particular case before another one is scheduled. You execute somebody on a Tuesday or a Thursday or whatever day, and then that Friday or the following week, there's a new execution date.
The other thing is that, the death penalty is supposed to bring closure. Do you think that that is a talking point at this point?
Yeah. And in fact, we've seen numerous families, several of within this DeSantis execution spree have said, we don't want this execution. We didn't want it when the trial was happening. We don't want it now. The idea that an
Who's saying
execution,
that?
huh?
Who's saying that they don't want the execution?
Some of the families of the victims in the cases of executions that have already taken place in recent months in Florida have come out saying, we don't want the execution. Okay. But the fact remains that when you've been told, wait until we kill the guy and then you'll feel better, but you got to wait 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 or more years before you get this so-called closure and justice of an execution, what you're really doing is having your healing process put on hold. You're being sold this bill of goods that an execution is going to do anything to help you, when in fact, no amount of killing is going to bring back our loved ones. No amount of killing is going to fill that empty chair at the table when the family gathers. And again, it's actually worse for victim families too, because we're telling them, wait till we kill the guy and then you can feel better, but it's going to be decades. And it may come all the way up to the end, and then we're going to yank the rug out from under you, which happens pretty regularly. It's a bad public policy across the board. But really what victims' families need much more than an execution is counseling and services, and especially if the family has lost a wage earner, help paying the bills. I mean, there's so many other things that are a priority rather than maybe killing somebody else who may or may not be the right person or the most culpable person in the crime decades from now. That doesn't help.
You've talked about the trauma to corrections officers, to the people that actually carry out the death penalty. Can you talk to me a little bit about what you've heard and whether or not these details are too ugly for people to understand what actually happens?
Well, Ron McAndrew is a friend and a part of our organization on our advisory committee. He was the warden at Florida State Prison and carried out three of the last electric chair executions.
I was starting to have a mental anguish, trouble sleeping, drinking huge amounts of alcohol, try and numb the stress. There was a point after I left Florida State Prison that these men would come and sit on the edge of my bed at night. I told my wife that I was being haunted by the men that I had actually helped leave this world.
And this is a guy who's a red hat wearing MAGA all the way Republican. He talks about the people that he executed visiting him in his dreams. He talks about how it damages corrections workers to have to carry out these executions. If you're police and you come across a bank robbery and there's a shootout and people get killed, okay. You're in the military and there's a war and you're shooting at each other and people get killed, okay. But once you capture the enemy and you disarm him or her, then it's your obligation to protect them. You can no longer harm them. And that's the space that we're in, where now we're asking state workers to take on the burden of taking an otherwise healthy person and killing them when they don't need to be killed. That is a burden that we're asking state workers to take on. And we've seen it over and over again in South Carolina and Florida and many other states. In Ohio, the three of the last heads of the Department of Corrections executed dozens of people between them, left that work and joined the movement to abolish the death penalty because it doesn't work.
It's interesting because I actually did an interview recently with one of the state legislators who was the defense attorney for Alec Murdaugh, Dick Harpootlian. He was also the state senator who was pushing for the firing squad, saying it was more humane than what he had seen or what he knew of with the electric chair.
Pee Wee Gaskin was executed in the electric chair. His eyes exploded, his hair caught on fire. Was basically tortured to death. It took a while for him to die.
Well, when you want to talk about the firing squad, when they shoot straight, because the last guy killed by firing squad in South Carolina, none of the bullets were on the heart. They were all off center, way off center. And the thinking is that because the victim in that case was a police officer, that this was them getting their little vengeance. They shot and hit major organs and he had to bleed out and it took a couple of minutes. As opposed to the first person that they hit with a firing squad in South Carolina, the shot was dead on in the heart, boom, you're dead in seconds. And two of the last three firing squad executions in the country were like I just described with the other man. The other one was in Utah, and you look at the autopsy pictures there, the bullets were all grouped closely off center. And you're talking about these are the best marked shooters that we have, shooting from 15 or 20 feet with high-powered rifles, and they can't hit a target. I've never had firearms training, and I can hit a target from 20 feet with a rifle. Come on.
So why do you think they missed the target?
I think that was intentional. In South Carolina, one of them missed entirely. They don't fire a blank. And there's three shooters, and one bullet missed entirely. The other two were off center. It's because this guy needs to suffer more. That's their thinking. It's not about, are we making sure it's actually a quick and I don't believe that execution should be painless. For us, it's not about the method of execution, how we kill our prisoners. It's that we kill them when the system is as broken as it is. We have a system that, carved into the face of the U.S. Supreme Court building are the words equal justice under law. Those are the words carved into the building. And if that's the bedrock foundation of our legal system, anybody that's ever encountered the legal system knows that we don't have equal justice under law. What matters most is how much money you have walking into the courthouse.
Well, I want to throw it out to our viewers too that are going to be watching this interview, and drop a comment if you think that there are some crimes that deserve the death penalty or not, and why. I want to hear from people as they listen to our interview as well. But
Can I offer a different question?
Yes.
Okay, I mean, because I'm agree, there are people who deserve whatever they got coming. Do we deserve to do it? Can we trust government with the power to do it right every time, to always get it right, to always get the person who's the most culpable? We've got an execution coming up, and this is a regular thing that happens where the first person to turn state's evidence, actually, the guy we just killed the other night in Alabama, he was not the actual killer. And he made a claim that he was innocent entirely. That's a question mark for some people. I believe him. But regularly, we're killing people. It's called the law of parties in some states, where you're present to a crime, but you're not the actual killer. And the person who actually pulled the trigger turns state's evidence first, gets or has a different jury that decides not to execute, but they're executing people that were not the actual killer. And if you were just present, but somebody else pulled a gun and shot somebody, you should be executed rather than the actual shooter. That's how the system is failing us in particular. So again, if you don't trust government to tax us fairly, to fill potholes fairly, to come up with a vaccine fairly, appropriately, all those things, how are you trusting government with the power to kill? And how are they choosing who to kill?
I would love to hear what people think about that, because I think that
I would
that
too.
is, an eye for an eye. Is that happening, for the people that believe in sort of
Well,
eye for an eye justice? Is that what the death penalty is?
well, anybody that's thumping on the Bible and pulling out the Hebrew scriptures about justification for any kind of punishment doesn't understand those scriptures. An eye for an eye was not about getting even; it was about take no more than an eye for an eye. Okay.
Have you ever witnessed an execution?
No, I've never been invited to do so. If a person that I had a relationship with asked me to do so, I would, but I've never had that invitation. I'm not looking forward to it. I know many people who have, and I can tell you that it damages them too.
Well, I was going to tell you that I actually was one of the media pool, as a reporter, for a South Carolina execution. This past year, it was a lethal injection. But I wanted to say, yes, I mean, I think that walking into those situations, you take away a moment of what you witnessed and why you were there. For me, it was incredibly important to be there so that it didn't happen in the dark,
Uh-huh.
and that the media plays a role. It's actually in our Constitution, it's the
I,
law that we
I
have
agree
to
with
have the
that.
media there.
That's
And
important.
if I'm gonna be asked to do that, I feel like it helped me understand a little bit more of what that process looked like.
Sure, and it's vital that the media is doing that. In most states, that's the way it works. In Indiana, for example, they don't allow the media to witness executions, and they've not been successful in suing for that access. It's vital that the media is paying attention and seeing what government is doing in all of our names. And I'm sorry that you had to go through that as part of your job. Uh, hopefully it's not impacting you too much. But that's, something that you end up when you got a job that, you have to look at the tragedies of life. That's part of it, right?
Absolutely, and I think that it certainly informed my reporting a lot better to be able to understand what was going on, when that curtain got pulled back, and to see what the room looked like, and to be able to understand what was the sense in that prison the day that it happened. While we were sitting there, we waited for the curtain to open. The curtain opened pretty quickly after we got in there, after 6 o'clock. And as he said, that's when Boyd was able to read the statement that had been provided, which was quite lengthy. And those last words from Marion Bowman, I think all of those things go into account. But yeah, I was interested to see if you had actually witnessed. And of course, there's several different methods now, so that also plays a huge factor into what you're witnessing, right?
Sure, sure. So when they pulled back the curtains on the case that you watched, was the person already set up with their
Yeah.
IV in and everything? See, we believe that you should be witnessing it from the time that the prisoner has walked or rolled in their wheelchair, as the case is regularly, from the time they enter the death chamber. The media and the public should be watching that, because often where the real problem is in getting that IV started. It's one thing to be trained to shoot, but we're not at, but few people are trained to gas suffocate or to electrocute or to lethally inject somebody.
Well, I want to go back to a couple of points on the Norman Grimm, what he did, and then it basically said he would be willing to die for his crimes. Norman Grimm brutally murdered his neighbor, an attorney, stabbed her, beat her with a hammer, sexually assaulted her, and then dumped her in the Pensacola Bay. Explain to me why we're sparing his life when he's asking to be killed, basically.
Well, there's two things there. One is, if it's your loved one who was killed, that's the worst of the worst. And it doesn't matter if they never saw the bullet coming or if they were tortured for 2 weeks before they died, right? If it's your loved one, that's the worst. And the question has to be then, why aren't we killing all of them? Why are we not killing all of them? And the reason is because we can't, because our system is set up to try to get the worst of the worst, and there's so many things that have to be in place that make it to get to a place where even so we're still not getting the worst of the worst. And this is where the real problem is. It's not about what they did. It's about who we are. And can we be trusted with this power to kill and this obligation, if you will, to kill, because we're already failing in the obligation? How is that fair? And what is that saying to most victim families? Your loved one wasn't valuable enough. When in fact, it's actually a gift to people where there's not a death sentence in those cases, because they can begin their healing process from the time the trial is over, not wait for decades to maybe see an execution decades from now and maybe get some healing out of that. No, what heals us is being able to remember our loved ones as they were, and as in our relationships with them, and to not be set on this idea that I must have vengeance in
Well,
order to do
I
that.
want
The
to play.
government's going to get the vengeance for me. You
I want to
know,
play devil's advocate a little bit with you about that, because victims, whether or not they believe in the death penalty, victims' families have to live with the idea that yes, maybe they won't get parole, maybe they will go into prison for life without parole. But I've seen many of these victims having to face their killers over and over again. This re-traumatization of, oh my God, what if he gets out? What if he or she gets out?
well, I mean, these days, the alternative to the death penalty is throwing away the key. And yes, there's always ways for there to be an appeal to on some level, but that's what happens when suddenly we realize we've got the wrong guy. Are we okay with executing the wrong person? Yeah, not always is that the case, but we've had exonerated and freed over 200 people off of death rows in this country, and there's a whole second subset of people that took what's called an Alford plea or something similar to that, where basically they're given an opportunity to plead to a lesser offense and be sentenced to time served, and then walk out the door today rather than face retrial. That's a face-saving move for prosecutors. So there's a number of people that took that opportunity, but ultimately, I agree with you 100% that if you've got a life without parole sentence, then unless there's a real question of guilt that can be raised in court and the court is willing to look at it, then that should be it. Throw away the key, die in prison, we're done. And we don't hear about it until we get a notice 2 seconds that the person died, and
I'm not going to argue with you about like the throw away the key, except for one thing that I do want to understand where you're coming from is, why should that person live when the victim's family has lost their loved one?
because we're not the Taliban. We're not Saudi Arabia. We're not going to actually, both of those entities put the gun in the victim's hands and say, go ahead and kill them if you want to, but you also have the power to forgive. The question becomes one of, if we're going to have a fair process and a fair and consistent government system, then there needs to be an ultimate punishment that goes across the board for all killers. And again, if it's your loved one that was killed, that's the worst of the worst, right? And it doesn't matter how they died. There's certainly people that have committed awful crimes who deserve whatever they get coming. But government isn't doing it in a fair and equitable way. And what we do know is that if we try to increase the number of executions, we're going to increase the number of mistakes.
What about the costs of just leaving somebody in prison versus letting them rot in prison until they die,
Well,
or just killing them? Why am I paying for to have somebody sitting in prison for the rest of their life until they die?
If you're worried about money, we're spending a lot more just to convict and sentence them to death than to try to execute them a couple decades from now. Although does that whole circus that goes on in the last few weeks of a person's life before an execution is also another $1 or $2 that they're spending. And all those police officers that have to stand around watching protesters who are nonviolent and just being there to pray is kind of ridiculous. But the truth is that when a prosecutor decides that he or she is going to seek a death sentence, they're decided to spend at least twice as much money just on the trial. And because if you had any money when you were arrested, you certainly don't by the time the trial is over. We're paying for both sides. We're paying for the defense and the prosecution. And what that means is, because death is different, it's a whole extra people, extra set of people, extra set of research that goes on, extra time preparing for the trial. All of that costs more. So a trial where they're seeking a death sentence is spending so much more money just for the trial, which itself is a roll of the dice. Because first you have to get a conviction, then you have to get a jury to decide what the sentence is going to be, death or throw away the key. Whereas if you're not seeking the death penalty and you get a conviction, then that's it, throw away the key. Okay. So, and then if you get to a point later, half of all death sentences are overturned during the appeals process. That's not the conviction, that's the sentence. And then we get to go back and do that sentencing process over again. More money. Okay. So if money is your concern, we're spending a lot less when we're not seeking a death penalty. This is, in fact, one of the things that made me change my mind on the death penalty was learning. I live in Ohio, and this is true across the country. You have to kill in a county that can afford a death penalty trial to even face the death penalty. Kill in a rural county where they don't have a large tax base to be able to afford all of that trial level stuff, they can't even afford the trial. And, I'm sure you've had situations where you live in Ohio, where I live. We had a case in Pike County, the Pike County murders a few
I know
years ago.
that case. That's a crazy case.
It's well, yeah, the legislature had to pass special legislation to appropriate like $4 million just to be able to have a death penalty trial in those cases. And they've pled them all out. They don't need, we know, because we've abolished the death penalty in New Jersey, New Mexico, Maryland, Illinois, Connecticut, Colorado, Virginia, other states. They're able to get plea deals without the threat of a death sentence. We know that. And so there's no reason to have the death penalty, except if we want to spend more money or give people who are elected something they can say, I'm tougher than that guy because I'll seek the death penalty, or I'll get the death penalty, or I'll give the death penalty for a judge. The common thread among almost everybody that's executed is abuse, neglect, and addiction at childhood. That's what we can see in almost everybody. So the question is, if we really want to prevent murder, are we doing more to intervene in the lives of children that are impacted in their own families and in their lives by abuse, neglect, and addiction?
That there is still a difference between mental health and like somebody that goes out and kills basically. But I did want to.
Mental health applies to all of us. The question is, could we have intervened in a person's life if they'd had better mental health care? I think that's always, there's lots of issues here. But at the end of the day, we can't trust government with this power, and we shouldn't, because we know that they will get it wrong.
And I want to ask you, besides that, like personally, if you don't mind me asking, you don't have to answer it, but personally, or people that are close to you at the executive level with this group have been victims of crime themselves, and know what that feeling is of someone that has been.
I'm grateful that I personally have not experienced the murder of a loved one in recent generations in my family, but our board chair emeritus, who was our board chair until just a few months ago, is Reverend Sharon Risher. Her mother and 2 cousins were among the 9 victims in the Charleston church shooting by Dylan Ruth. And I'm sure you know about that one too.
I covered it.
We worked very closely together to try to get the president to commute all those death sentences, including for Dylan Ruth, the racist who are trying to start a race war, went and shot up that church and killed her, again, her mother and 2 cousins. another of our board members, is her brother was murdered, and she actually had the opportunity. People said, well, we can get street vengeance for you, because they knew who did it. And she said, no, I don't want that. So, we work closely with a group called Journey of Hope from Violence to Healing, which is led by murder victim families who oppose the death penalty.
And when you talk to them, including this beautiful reverend that you're mentioning, who, yes, I do know that story intimately, because of course I was here, a witness to it, in that way, like through the whole experience. I was in the Dylan Roof sentencing,
Yes.
as part of the media. I was there for the trial. I know what you mean, but it is so hard to believe that they can turn the other cheek, however you want to put it.
Well, for some, it's like being a Christian. Reverend Risher came to understand the damage of it later in the process, when every time it comes up for an appeal, it's like revisiting the day that
Oh,
her mother was murdered, right? And that's
yeah.
part of why the death penalty fails us, because it takes so long. Even if you want to waive your appeals, it's still going to take quite a period of time. And like I said, every time it comes up in the news, we're hearing about the killer, not the victims. And you have to relive the worst day of your life over and over and over again, and maybe get to a point where there's an execution. That's
Well, I
no
know,
way to
Abe,
remember our loved ones.
I mean, you've raised so many points for people to think about, and I really want people to think about how, as we're going into this, really a flood of executions in Florida right now, it certainly is setting a precedent in other states. How do we feel about that? Was there any point, you mentioned it earlier, was there a point where you changed your opinion about the death penalty? Am I right about that?
Yes, I encountered people in school and set out to try to prove them wrong. And in trying to prove them wrong, that everything I believed about the death penalty was right, I found out that I was mistaken. And that's the challenge I put to everybody else. Don't take my word for it. Prove to yourself that what you believe to be the truth is actually the truth. Okay, what we have to do is set aside the idea that there are people who deserve whatever they get coming. And that's true. People deserve whatever they get coming. But once we put it into the hands of government, then it becomes a question of, do we have a system that is fair, accurate, always gets it right, cost effective? Is it what we need to be doing to be safe and hold them accountable? And the answer is no, the death penalty is not that. So, but again, what changed my mind was learning that you have to kill in a county that can afford a death
They can
penalty
afford
trial.
it.
If you can't afford it, you're not going to get it. And how is that fair? And if the death penalty is a commodity for victim families, how is it fair that we're using it in fewer than 2% of the time and making them wait decades?
How's history going to look back on this period for us? Okay.
Well,
Is
just
it a
as we,
stain, or is it a learning curve? What is this right now?
well,
Where are
yeah,
we?
actually, the death penalty is on its way out. We have a continuous trend of the lowest number, not just of new death sentences, but also capital indictments. And until this year, we've been on also a continuing trend of lower numbers of executions. But this year, we are on a path to have as many executions as we saw in 2012, which was 43, or maybe even 2010, which was 46 executions. We haven't had that many for so long. In all of last year, we had 25 executions, and we hit that number by the end of June this year, so halfway through the year. So we're in this spike. We see more states that are, but keep in mind, the people that are being executed have been there for decades. So they're playing catch up. In terms of new death sentences, it's still all-time lows. So just like slavery was abolished, racial discrimination, well, we're kind of in an off kind of situation right now with the current administration. But we have, what we know is that people are going to look back on history and say, oh my gosh, how did they allow government that power? That's where it's going to be. And it might take decades, it might take a century or more. I used to think we'd be able to accomplish this by the time I would turn 50, and now I'm 58, so we didn't hit that mark. But what I can say is that, and I know this because I've done it, where people come to actually understand how the system fails us, they will choose something other than death, other than the death penalty. And I know this because we've actually shown that in referenda where we've actually worked and gone in precincts house to house and spoken with people about that. I've done this in Florida. I've done this in Oklahoma. And we've seen that we can win, even in the reddest of precincts, when we get to have a conversation with people and they're not just voting on a gut reaction. You have to set aside the concept and look at the practice. If you believe in fairness, if you believe in equality, if you believe in good public policy, then you can't support the death penalty as it exists. And even if you put your stock in the scriptures, the death penalty that's in the Bible, whether you're Jewish and go by the Hebrew scriptures and the current rabbinic interpretation of the Torah, which is for 2,000 years, we have the death penalty, but we can't use it because we can't be trusted with it. Or if you go by the Gospels, then of course, if you're truly a follower of Jesus, Jesus said, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, and I tell you different. And let he who is without sin cast the first stone." So, if you're truly following the words of Jesus, then that's not gonna float either. But we're the United States, not the Taliban, and therefore we don't go by a fundamentalist biblical adherence to what people think is their interpretation of biblical law. We go by a civil law that is supposed to be separate from religion.
We will be watching to see how the country reacts. Is it getting desensitized, or are they paying attention to what's going on?
Most people have no idea this is happening and are not paying attention, and they have to catch your news story or one of those that is being published. And the biggest challenge we have now is just that it used to be everybody reads the newspapers and we all watch NBC, ABC, or CBS, and now if you get news at all, it's from very diverse ways, and that makes it really hard to make sure people know what's happening and to get accurate information across. So I appreciate your having me on, and I look forward to seeing what you create with this.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. A fascinating conversation, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk a lot more about it over the next
time. We've got another execution coming up in South Carolina.
Yes, we do. It'll be interesting to see if he chooses the electric chair, because no one has looked at the constitutionality of that recently, to see if that can be a sticking point.
I don't think there's any method of execution that they would find unconstitutional unless it was like truly a torture them to death kind of situation. The electric chair has been held up, so too is lethal injection, firing squad. The only one we haven't used recently, I mean, even this gassing, although Justice Sotomayor and Kagan and Jackson all together dissented and would have granted the appeal of Anthony Boyd, who was killed last week, when he was saying he'd prefer to be shot than gassed. Okay, so there's not been a real evaluation of what it really looks like to be suffocated to death with gas. If I had to pick myself, it'd be firing squad or maybe electric chair, because it hits you.
Well, you just said that they missed on that you think that possibly that those misses were not accidental.
Well, you're still dead in a minute or two. Okay. As
suffering.
opposed to what we know from the autopsies with lethal injections is it's your lungs filling up with fluid. You're drowning. What we know from gas suffocation is you're being deprived of oxygen, completely conscious of it for at least minutes. I mean, it took this guy over 30 minutes to be killed last week. And, so what we know, even if they hit off target, you're still going to bleed out in a minute or two. And I don't agree that executions have to be painless. That's what the U.S. Supreme Court has said. There's no guarantee of a painless execution. And how really can you have one? And if you actually understand the death penalty, then you know that the real torture of the death penalty is the wait. It's not the actual execution. It's we're going to kill you at such and such a time, and you're going to go through all of these, thinking through it for years. That's the torture of the death penalty.
15 executions, one question. Does justice always have to mean death? The next 2 executions are already scheduled. They're for November 13th, one in Oklahoma and another one in Florida. The day after that, Another execution is scheduled in South Carolina. Thanks for watching. I'm Anne Emerson. Drop your comments below because this debate is not over.